Welcome, my friends, to the Sage Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Returning to the show tonight is researcher, DJ, and radio show host Mark Devlin. In this show, Mark will discuss his new book, Musical Truth 2, which picks up where Musical Truth 1 left off in exposing the mass deception and social engineering agenda of the music industry. And so, without further ado, here's the conversation with Mark. Well, folks, welcome to another show, and my good friend Mark Devlin is with us once again. Mark and I have connected a number of times, Mark on my show and me on Mark's show. And Mark, I have to tell you, I have the utmost respect for you because you're one of the real genuine people in the truth community and the alternative research community. You're just a really good guy. You're a hard worker, and you're a great researcher. Today, we're going to talk about your follow-up book, which is Musical Truth 2, which you released in February. So it's only been out 2 months. And I tell people about your work that you really are a natural segue from, in my view, Dave McGowan's work. And now Dave's not with us anymore. And now you're doing a lot of work exposing what goes on in the music industry and that business, and helping people to understand that it is not at all what people are led to believe that it is. That it's very much controlled, it's engineered, and people in the big club, they run it. And I know we'll get into that with this discussion. But before we get into the book, because this kind of goes into the book anyway, we have Ringo Starr was just knighted, was he not? And another guy named Wiley, and you and I were talking about this before we got started. I don't really know who he is. I know he does grime music, but I don't know what that is either. So why don't you take it away and fill us in on what's going on there?
All right, Mike. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. It's great to be on the show. And thank you for the kind intro. I made the comment when I was doing the event in LA last week, where I got a nice intro as well, that it's like getting your obituary read, and the bonus is you don't even have to die. So it's all good. Okay, so yeah, let's start off this time talking about Ringo Starr, who cropped up in the New Year's honours list. And he got his knighthood just the other day. I'm not sure if it was CBE or some other form of knighthood. To be honest, they're all the same. It doesn't really matter if it's a CBE, MBE or OBE. They're all awards, so-called, given to people that have served the British Empire in some way. And it's usually services to some industry or other in terms of the official story. So his was services to culture and music. And no great surprise, really. I suppose the only surprise is he didn't get it sooner. And his old bandmate, Paul McCartney, whoever he may be, we weren't going to get into McCartney today, but I'm sure he'll crop up in the odd cameo, got his in 1997. So 21 years later, his old bandmate Ringo gets one. I can imagine Pete Best is probably pretty pissed off because he's still out there somewhere. He might be thinking that should have been me. Yeah. But yeah, I think it speaks volumes that John and George are dead and Paul and Ringo have got knighthoods. Of course, all the Beatles got MBEs back in 1965, and John Lennon later returned his in some manner of protest, which I can respect him for. But really, knighthoods and MBEs and all of that are a very strange thing when you think of it, because they're emblems of an empire which is among the most murderous and evil that humanity has ever seen. It's been responsible for slavery. It's been responsible for plundering the resources of foreign lands. It's been responsible for untold levels of human suffering. And it's not really something to be celebrated in my book. And I think it just speaks to the depth of mind control that society lives under, that this is something that people celebrate. And Ringo turned up at the palace to get his knighthood, flashing up the peace sign that he loves to do so frequently. And actually, there's nothing peaceful about the history of the British Empire or the monarchy and what they've stood for at all. So it really is quite astounding that people celebrate this. I mean, it astounds me that we've still got a monarchy at all, to be honest, that this country still tolerates this one family, which is elevated above all others and has all these special privileges afforded to it just by way of their genes, their bloodline. It's just incredible that in 2018 that institution is still alive and well. But yeah, Ringo at the palace, no great surprise. These things are given for services rendered, and I wonder if the services that he's rendered might be slightly different to the ones that the general public thinks of. And maybe this would be connected into the aforementioned McCartney situation. And what do you think about that?
Well, now we know why Ringo hasn't said anything about the whole McCartney situation. And, there's always people bantering around and talking about whether Ringo would spill the beans about McCartney being swapped out back in 1966. I was joking with a friend of mine on Facebook, Tommy Collier, and Tommy's he's a musician out of Tennessee, out of Memphis. He's a really good guy, and we talk a lot about the McCartney conspiracy. We go back and forth and just have a couple of chuckles between ourselves. And I said to him, well, reason why Ringo had to wait 21 years is because he was in the penalty box. He wrote the song Back Off Boogaloo, which was all about, him. He was basically crapping on Billy.
Right.
And so, he was basically told, look, okay, now you're going to have to wait a long time before you get one of these.
Right.
So 21 years later, Ringo gets his, I guess it was an MBE. No, he had an MBE already, right? He got it when he was early with the Beatles. Well, he got knighted, right? He's Sir Ringo Starr.
Well, that was in 65 for all the Beatles, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, and I agree that, it's very weird because people have cognitive dissonance that they just embrace this whole thing and not understanding and realizing what the whole crown is all about and all the wickedness that it has brought to the world. And people just fawn over this stuff. I see people all the time just going on and on about, oh, Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Paul, Sir Macca. And I think to myself, you stop it. You're driving me crazy with that stuff. It's just people don't know. And the problem is that they really don't even take the time to find out.
Yeah.
So, so that's why you and I talk about it, because it's just you and I.
Well, yeah.
Nobody else knows about this stuff or wants to know about it.
This reality just feels like the plot to some really implausible Hollywood movie sometime, where the whole of society is under mind control, but just a small group of people can actually see the elephant in the room, that which is so obvious. And then you realize that actually it's not a Hollywood movie, it's the reality that we live in. There have been some very unlikely candidates that have been getting knighthoods recently, actually, in the music world. So we had Goldie, the drum and bass DJ and producer, a couple of years ago. So he picked up an MBE. They've been giving them to DJs. So there's a DJ by the name of Pete Tong, who has been on BBC Radio 1 for the past 27 years. He recently relocated to LA, so he lives out there. And he's one of the key players on the electronic dance music scene now, which is absolutely massive in the US. And to my mind, it's pretty clear that he's been recruited at some stage along the way. He's been stepped up a few levels in the industry. His career has been elevated because he's now playing at all these big festivals. He's working as a consultant for various entertainment agencies. He's recruited to do film scores for major movies. This guy is a key player. And I think it speaks volumes that he picked up an MBE just the other year. You've got a reggae DJ by the name of David Rodigan, who picked up an MBE also. He's a bit of a legend on the reggae scene. He's highly respected. He's been in sound clashes with Jamaican DJs and crews, and he's definitely put in the work over the years. But very strange choice for an MBE. Or is he? Because you look into his background, and his father worked in the military, and he got various postings around the world, and David was actually born on a military base in Germany before he came back to England. So there we are again with yet another military background. And also, Rodigan was trained as an actor. So he was a stage actor before he became a DJ. And of course, I get into lifetime actors and the way their public persona is so often a construct. And when you get into their background, you get the truth about them. So there's another unusual candidate. You got Jazzy B of Soul to Soul, who picked up an MBE. You got a guy called Norman J, this black DJ out of West London, who's famous for playing Notting Hill Carnival. He picked up an MBE. There's a few others from the DJ world. Annie Nightingale, who's a veteran Radio 1 presenter. And then just the other day, as you mentioned, we had this grime artist by the name of Wiley. Most unlikely candidate for an MBE. So we got this genre of music called grime, which comes out of East London. And it's very specific to that geographical area, to be honest. Grime isn't felt everywhere in the UK. I think if you went up north, there'd be very few people that were into it. So it's very much a London thing, and specifically an East London thing. But Wiley and Dizzy Rascal have been the two main flag wavers for that scene for the past several years. It's like a UK twist on rap music, basically. It's very fast beats. The name is appropriate because it sounds grimy, it sounds raw and rugged and edgy and bass heavy, quite dissonant to my ears. So it's music that's lapped up by young people, but people of my age don't really dig it, it's just for the kids. So Wiley and Dizzy Rascal, I've had this rivalry going on, and I was looking just yesterday at this Twitter war that they've had, going back and forth. And Dizzy Rascal has been accusing Wiley of being a crackhead, and he's also accused him of being a paedophile. So in this very public exchange of tweets, he accused him of having had sex with the 14-year-old daughter of some DJ associate from the grime scene. And he made a comment that you're the most protected... No, I've never known a nonce more protected since Savile. And that's quite a button-pushing phrase to have mentioned Jimmy Savile in the same sentence. So, is there more to know about Wiley? Is this just manufactured hype? Or is that possibly some clue as to why he's picked up his MBE? So we had Goldie the other year, as I say, this drum and bass DJ, and he hit the headlines a few weeks ago where he's involved in assaulting this guy. This violent case where he beat this guy up and it went to court. So there's someone else who got an MBE. So we're entrained to think of these people as being morally upstanding and these good positive role models for young people. And this is the kind of behaviour that they engage in. And then you've got the whole situation with sirs, sir this, sir that. There have been so many British politicians who have been sirs and lords who have been exposed as paedophiles. And this has happened in the mainstream press. So it's not even conspiracy theory or the realm of the alternative media. Mainstream newspapers have reported that Sir Cyril Smith and Sir Clement Freud and Lord Greville Janner, Lord McAlpine, all exposed as paedophiles. Sir Edward Heath, former British Prime Minister, it's come out in the British press that he was a paedophile and probably murdered young boys when he took them out on this yacht that he used to have. He was an associate of Jimmy Savile, who was also a sir. So who the hell would want to be in that club, really, looking at the company you keep? It's not exactly an accolade to be proud of. So I just wonder if all these knighthoods and these sirhoods and these MBEs are for services rendered rather different to the ones that we think of. It's not a good club to be a part of.
No, it's not. And what folks have to come to grips with, which is tough for a lot of people because these people are put up as celebrities and icons and people worship them, and they're actually working on behalf of an agenda. And I'm not saying that they don't work hard at what they do.
Right.
I want to make sure I make that clear too. A lot of these DJs and these artists and these bands, they work very hard to get where they've gotten. But the thing is, point I try to make to folks, Mark, is that, but they're able to work hard and progress because they're in the system. The system is supporting them in their endeavors to move forward, to make more money, to reach higher levels of stardom. Because if you're not in the system, if you're not sanctioned by the Masons or Secret Society or the Crown, then you're not going anywhere. You're never going to receive an MBE. In fact, no one's going to even know who you are for all intents and purposes. And so the picture that gets drawn is all of these artists, all of these stars, especially the ones that are very notable, people know who they are, the celebrities, they are part of the system and they're doing work on behalf of the controllers. And that work entails social engineering, it entails mind control, all kinds of stuff. Right. And they're doing it through music. And, the thing is, music is very special to human beings, right? Humans love music. And so they've taken something that really should be, in my view, very organic, very pleasing, something that's maybe very inspiring and motivating, and they've turned it into something that is, it's turning out wickedness, in my view.
And people would never believe that humanity could stoop this low to these levels of duplicity because you and I wouldn't do this. You and I would not be capable of this type of deception. But we're dealing with an entirely different breed of individual here. We're talking psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, Satanists. Their mindsets, their worldview are entirely different to ours. they don't think twice about lying and deceiving us because it's just another day at the office to them. And there's all kinds of occult aspects to this. So there's the concept of placing the truth in plain sight and revelation of the method, which I talk about a lot, which is where they give us the opportunity to understand what they're doing to us by placing little clues and calling cards all over the place. And it's done in very cryptic encoded form so that you've got to be well versed in symbolism and in these doctrines to be able to understand what's being communicated. But nevertheless, as they see it, they're giving you a chance to know. So I think there's two scenarios going on here when it comes to these celebrities when they're being used for social engineering. I think some of them do start off as genuine and grassroots, and they have worked their way up from nothing. And I think there are probably talent spotters on behalf of these industries that look out for individuals like this. And when they find someone that they consider to have some skill and some talent, they will approach them and see if they can be bought off and make them all kinds of offers that are very attractive to an up-and-coming, struggling musician or actor or whatever. And many of them will take that contract, and that's when their career gets elevated a few levels and they sign themselves over, and from that point on, their life and their career is no longer their own. And the other way that individuals achieve it is by being born into it. So we're back to bloodlines. They come from a family where they're selected for these roles. And I've looked a lot into some of these bloodlines and how far back into history they go, how many generations. And what you find is different generations of the same family are ushered into different public roles. So some of them might go down the route of politics. Some of them might be actors. Some of them might be sports stars, even television presenters. And some of them will be business leaders like Bill Gates and Richard Branson, people like that. And then others will be musicians. And they're just given these roles and they step into them. And I think there's going to be training schools and foundations all over the place where these lifetime actors, the ones that are born into these roles, are given the best possible training. Because you're right, you know, these Hollywood actors are incredible at their art. And some of these musicians make awesome music. So it's pretty clear they're getting the best training. So when money is no object and any amount of cash can be thrown at training somebody up to be a highly skilled and polished performer, then that's what happens. Another thing we have is a lot of these deceivers, because that's what so many of these public figures are. We think of them as on our side. We think of them as our friends. But that's why it's very dangerous to have heroes, because we don't really know these people. All you know is the public version of them, the Wikipedia account of what they're all about. You don't see what they get up to when the camera stops rolling or when they step off that stage. So they're not your friend. And so many of them masquerade under this guise of doing good works. So philanthropists and doing good work for charity. And it's just another way of them keeping their true nature hidden and another way of deceiving and duping the rest of us. So look at some of the cover personas that we have for some of these individuals. David Rockefeller, for instance, who died finally last year. Thought it would never happen, but eventually
thank God.
His mortality caught up with him. So he was described as a philanthropist. And anyone who's done 5 minutes research into what David Rockefeller stood for would realize that he's anything but a philanthropist, but that was his public persona. Then you got the Rothschilds. So the Rothschild family have one of their country mansions very close to where I live, Waddesdon, near Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire. And I've been to visit Waddesdon Manor, and it's a bit of a creepy-ass place. But you go in the front door and there's a great big plaque there describing the Rothschild family as philanthropists and art collectors. So their public image is, oh, they're just these nice aristocrats that like collecting art and statues and stuff. And then you think of Jimmy Savile, and he was known for doing lots of great work for charity. He ran marathons and he was the patron of children's wards at hospitals. And unfortunately, we now know why he was so closely involved with children's wards in hospitals. But for many decades, he successfully masqueraded under the guise of being this really nice guy. Then there was Rolf Harris. He did kids' shows on TV. He had Rolf's Animal Hospital, where he rescued small animals and nursed hedgehogs back to health and that sort of thing. So everyone thinks, oh, what a nice guy he is. He's so cuddly and fluffy and nice. and then the truth about him emerges. So my message to people would be, just don't be fooled by these public images and don't have these heroes. Don't be putting people on these pedestals. You don't really know them. They're not your friends. They're not there to enrich your life in any way.
That's absolutely right, Mark. And I'm glad that you pointed out that there really are two avenues in which they get their pipeline of artists. One being, like you said, that artists will start organically and then they get their claws into them.
Right.
And then once they get them into the system, then they can manipulate and maneuver and, you know, and give them incentives to go in a certain direction. And then there are those that are essentially part of the system from the very beginning. They've always been there. That was going to be their lot in life, that they were going to go down that path because they need those people. They need, you know, that stable of, as you call them, lifetime actors to be in the system, to be in the pipeline. But that in itself, that's not going to fill out the whole picture. So they do have to have a pool of resources outside. And the thing is, once these young people get sucked into the system, their lives change. I mean, one of the people that comes to mind is Katy Perry. You know, I know somebody that knew her when she was Katie Hudson. And this person was telling me that the difference between the person he knew as Katie Hudson and the person that we now know as Katy Perry, I mean, it's night and day. It's night and day, you know. So, yeah, you know, it's very important to point that out. And I also agree with you that people have to stop putting people up on pedestals. They really do. And really try to understand more about what this person is about. And even if you just take the time to break down the music from the standpoint of even just the lyrics, take a look at the lyrics. Most people don't pay a lot of attention to lyrics, you know, and you can start to get some insight as to where it is they're going with the music and what it is they're trying to push forward as far as an agenda goes. But some very good points, especially about the pipeline of resource that feeds into the system, into the beast.
Let me just throw in a comment from Dave McGowan, who you mentioned earlier as well. I've included this in the book, and this was a comment he made on an interview with Freeman. And McGowan said, I guess if there's one thing I would say to people, it would be to just be very careful about who you choose as your icons and leaders, because these people may not be who you think they are. Be very skeptical of anyone in Hollywood who has a political agenda. So there's some parting words there from the late Dave McGowan.
Yeah, you also mentioned something that was important too. As an example, if you were or I were approached and we were told, look, you can make a lot of money, you can have a lot of celebrity, but you need to do X, Y, and Z. You and I would say, I'm not doing that. Right. If you're asking me to go outside of what I'm comfortable with, if you're asking me to be part of social engineering, if you're asking me to be deceptive, I'm not going to do that. So it really does take a certain breed of person that will say, yeah, okay, money? Yeah, I'm going to get a lot of money? Sure, just tell me what it is you want me to do and I will do it. And God knows there are a lot of people, they won't even blink. If the money's there, they'll do it.
Although I do wonder, if you're an up-and-coming musician and you get that visit from that guy in the sharp suit in the nice car that comes with a glittering contract and a briefcase, and he says, we want to elevate you up a few levels. We want you to be one of our key players, but you're going to have to do this, this, and this. If that's a deal that you don't fancy, I wonder if you're then able to say, no, you're all right, mate. Don't worry about it. Because then you've become aware of the fact that that's how the industry works. And they're not going to want you going out there and revealing that. Or could it be that it's not revealed to you at that stage exactly what you're going to have to do? And all they give you is promise of fame and fortune and great riches, and once you've signed your name on the dotted line, that's when you get invited to attend one of these Eyes Wide Shut style parties the following week. Bring your own GIMP mask, you know.
Yeah, I think it's very incremental. So, and what I was referring to is those people, those folks, Mark, that actually continue to plod along and continue to take the money. And at some point, unless you just don't have a brain in your head, you have to realize where you're at and what you're doing. But I think in the beginning, it's, as you just said, I think it's incrementalized. They come, they show up, they paint a nice picture. We'd like to invest in you. We think you have tremendous talent. You can go places and we'll back you. There's investment and so on. And you're thinking, okay, yeah, this is great. This is what I'm doing this for, right? Be a famous artist, whatever it may be. And as you move along, more and more gets added to what they expect you to do.
Yeah, another artist I meant to mention when I was talking about all the MBEs and CBEs and stuff was Kate Bush. So Kate Bush took a CBE from the Queen in, I think it was 2012. That's Commander of the British Empire. So that's a higher accolade than Order of the British Empire and Member of the British Empire. That's a pretty special one. And that was at the tail end of a 40-year career. Kate Bush is an artist I've always enjoyed. She's always been like a breath of fresh air because she's been so different from anyone else out there. Highly innovative, highly creative. When she first came on the scene, 40 years ago actually, Wuthering Heights, her first hit single, was #1 in the UK exactly 40 years ago today. And that's just a masterpiece. That's an incredible piece of work. And she just came across, when she first emerged, as like this otherworldly spirit. She had this ghostly kind of air to her. And just such a great artist. So it's so disappointing for me to see her taking a CBE at the tail end of that long career. And it just makes me wonder, was she bought and paid off at some point along the way, or has she been down with the program since day one? Now, when you look at some of the imagery in her early videos for songs like The Man with the Child in His Eyes, you see hints at multiple personality disorder. So you got many different versions of Kate on screen at the same time. I did a lot of analysis into 1970s and 1980s pop videos in the research for this book, and that was one of the videos I looked at. So you got like 3 Kates on screen at the same time. And there are other videos where she appears in the same way. And that's a classic way of rendering dissociative identity disorder, all these different personalities, which comes as a result of trauma-based mind control. So that's a bit of a red flag. Then you realise that her father was a doctor. There's very little information available online to discover what kind of doctor he was or what kind of work he was into. But he was definitely a doctor of some kind. And so you get a couple of elements that we've seen crop up so many other times. And now I've got to ask myself questions about how genuine and organic she was from day one. And there are so many favourite artists I've had to do that with. I've had to do it with DJs I used to look up to, and music producers, and you discover stuff about them. And you come to realise that anyone that's enjoyed any level of success to the point that they've become a household name, and the average person in the street has heard of them, has either had their career facilitated for them from day one, or at some point they were bought off, and now they're doing the bidding of those that control these industries. It's a very harsh truth to come to terms with. That's why I get so much hateful vitriol spat at me on YouTube and Facebook and when I do public talks and stuff, because this is not a very popular subject area for a lot of people. And my job and that of other researchers who do this kind of work is not easy, because people think you're just out to piss all over their icons and their heroes and you're doing it just for shits and giggles. That's not why I do this. It's very difficult for me to have to come to terms with some of this stuff. But truth is truth. You can either handle it or you can't. And when you come across it, you either take on the personal responsibility for communicating it, no matter how difficult it is, or you don't. It's one thing or the other.
Yeah, and I remember Kate Bush. Mark, it's funny you should bring her up. I mean, you were just taking me down memory lane. But I think what happens is they have different approaches to things, and hers may have been a lot more subtle than some of the other bands and artists that were asked to go down a certain path. Certainly, listening to you explain the video with multiple people, personalities, I mean, that, just rings of multiple personality disorder, which is something that is MK Ultra.
Yeah.
Mind control program, that's what they do. They break it down to, multiple personalities and so on. So I think that, some of the stuff is more subtle, and while, like I said, others are more overt and in our face. And I also agree that this is a tough thing to talk about, because people do think that all you're doing is raining on their parade.
Right.
They want to say, oh, are you telling me no music out there is good, or no music out there is organic, or it's all control? That's ridiculous. I love that artist. That I grew up with that artist, and I feel good when I hear their songs. And look, I get it. Okay. I get it, because the hardest pill for me to swallow was when I started really looking into the McCartney thing. the McCartney conspiracy, because I was a Beatle freak growing up ever since I was like 8 years old. And I learned to play guitar and write music based upon the Beatles. And I believed everything. I read all these books about the Beatles and the stories about the Beatles and everything else. And I ate it all up. And I just thought it was just one great wholesome story,
Right.
And then when I started digging into it, that bubble was popped, So it's not something I wanted to like really to experience. It's not something that I really wanted to believe. But, because you believe something doesn't make it true. That's the thing. Believing that something is true doesn't make it true. And so what people have to do is they have to just pause for a second and assess and evaluate all of this stuff, and understand that the world is controlled. I was on Freeman's show a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah,
and I talked about this. Yeah, it's controlled. And for people who don't believe it's controlled, I don't know really what to say. But it is, and you have to come to grips with the fact that virtually every aspect of what you do in life is controlled, Right? So, and people, they don't get it, and they don't want to accept that because they want to believe they're not controlled. They want to believe that they're free. They can come and go as they please. And you can come and go as you please to a degree, right? You just can't get on an airplane. You just can't get on the road without a license. You can't get on a road that has a toll and not pay the toll. These are just small examples, but what I'm trying to say is it's all these little nuances and bigger things. They all add up at the end of the day. And when you take a step back and you look at it all in its entirety, you realize that there is one gigantic octopus hanging over our heads.
I was chatting with Jan Irvin over at Gnostic Media about this a while back, and he raised the subject of Bob Marley. I've always loved Bob Marley's music. I always thought Bob Marley was one of the good ones. I still don't quite know what to make of him, but Jan Irvin raised the point that Bob Marley's father was a naval commander for a time, British Navy, Norvell Sinclair Marley, and he ran a plantation in Jamaica for some time, like a slave plantation. How do you reconcile that with Bob Marley being this conscious reggae artist? I kind of expressed some exasperation at that, and I said, "Oh, not Bob Marley, please." And he said to me, "Everyone's got someone that they don't want to hear it about." I've included a quote from Jan Irvin as well in the book, in the Lifetime Actors section. And he's talking about Terence McKenna. So he discovered some stuff about Terence McKenna. He was always a great admirer of his. He saw him as this great consciousness guru, psychedelic era icon. And then he came across this quote from Terence McKenna speaking at the Esalen Institute in California in 1994, where he basically admitted to being on the payroll of the FBI for some time. It's there in his own words. And Jan Irvin said, 10 years ago, I released 70 hours of McKenna audio to the internet, and now in hindsight, I'm looking at all of his research and everything going, my God, look what he was into. So it's my duty, having discovered that I was mind-controlled myself, to put this information out there to help others. And they may hate me for it in the interim, but I think that the people who take the time to actually read the information and look at it closely will find it very liberating, because it's much easier to spend a few hours or days or weeks researching facts than it is to spend a lifetime believing lies. Just going back quickly to the Kate Bush thing as well, the reason I mentioned her father was some kind of doctor is because we get this a lot. The father of Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd, who went a bit mad. The official story there is that he did way too much LSD in the late 60s and it fried his brains and he couldn't function anymore and he had to be kicked out of the band. But his father was involved in research for Cambridge University in England, and he was involved in all kinds of stuff connected to mind control and the use of psychedelics. And of course, our old mate, Dr. Richard Asher, the father of Jane Asher, the one-time girlfriend of Paul McCartney, was involved in all kinds of research as well. I think connected to hypnosis and other mind
psychiatric work.
Right. And then the father of Nicole Kidman, the famous Hollywood actress, was a doctor as well in Australia, involved in all kinds of nefarious stuff. So you often find that when the fathers don't come from the military in some way, they're involved in some kind of, medical research or psychological research on behalf of government departments. That's why it's important to mention that. So we get these things cropping up time and time again. And when you look at some of the subject matter that cropped up in Kate Bush's music, it did display quite high levels of knowledge of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So she had this song called Experiment 4, and it was about sound weaponry, the weaponization of sound, and the government with this secret project to use sound to affect people in a negative way as warfare. And she also had the song Cloudbustin' and that great video that was shot on Whitehorse Hill in Uffington, again just a stone's throw from where I am in Oxfordshire, which is all about the work of Wilhelm Reich and his orgon technology and cloud seeding and weather manipulation and stuff like that. So, these aren't subject matters that your average pop music artist gets into. So it all becomes very interesting when you throw it all together and consider it as part of the big picture.
Yeah, and you mentioned Terence McKenna and Esalen, and Esalen is a product of Tavistock.
Right.
So
I think Aldous Huxley was involved in the setting up of that, or he was involved in some way with that project.
Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing, when you start to connect the dots and go back and figure out who's connected to what. It really starts to have a theme: military, intelligence, Tavistock, all of these organizations, and I'm talking about, folks, the celebrities and the artists that are really the big names, especially. I'm not saying the ones with lesser star quality are not involved also, but the ones that really are at the top of the heap, we really need to inspect them very carefully, because they got there because they were put there. They were helped along, and and because the system is controlled, and it is controlled, they had to play ball. There had to be an agreement that says, yes, I'm going to do this, this, and that in order to get here. So this is very, very good information, Mark, that you're bringing forward.
Well, thanks. And we can also throw in that comment made by Terence McKenna. I don't have the exact quote here, but I can remember the gist of it. So it was along the lines of, he said he was hiding out in La Chorrera in Panama in 1971. And he says the FBI, so he actually names the agency, he says they caught up with me. I was running out of money. I was at the end of my rope. The FBI caught up with me and they said, with someone with a mouth like yours, there's a job for you inside the agency. And he said, from that day to this, I've been working in deep cover operations, about which the less said, the better. So we seem to have an admission straight from the horse's mouth there that while he may have started out as this genuine individual with noble aims, there came a point where he was approached by one of these agencies and they made him an offer he couldn't refuse and they got him on the books. So that would be a little insight into how it's done, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably how it's done many times. And if an artist or a potential personality or celebrity, if they're at a point where they are struggling, I don't have enough money to buy food, I don't have, enough money to pay the rent, whatever. If somebody comes along and says, hey, we see talent in you. And this is what we were saying before. We can help you along. We can do things for you. And so I think that with some of these folks, the initial response is survival, maybe in some cases. Okay, well, what do you want me to do? Well, we'd like you to do this, this, and that. And maybe it doesn't seem very nefarious at that point. Okay, I can do that. And then it continues, to move along. It continues to get more and more involved as far as the social engineering, the mind control, and stuff like that. And there has to reach a point, I think, where I think there's a point, I should say it this way, where it's a point of no return for some of these folks. In other words, there's a line in the sand. Yeah. And if you don't cross that line, you can step back and you're okay. But if you cross over that line, then all bets are off. Right. Then you're in. You can never really leave. You might want to think you could leave, but you can't leave. So I had a person from I met him back in 2012 or 13 or so. I'm trying to remember. And I was taking a class. This is a little off topic, folks, as far as music, but I think Mark will appreciate this. And he was retired from one of the intelligence agencies here in the United States. It was the NSA. I'll just say it. I was talking to him, and he didn't know me from a hole in the wall. We were just chatting, and he was an older guy. He was probably in his mid-60s. And he told me, he said, you never really leave. You never leave. Even when you're retired, right? you're still monitored.
Well,
They still keep a pulse on you.
How many times do we see that in Hollywood movies where you got some grizzled old agent that's supposedly retired and he's enjoying life with his grandkids or whatever, or going fishing or whatever, and he gets that call and he says something like, "Just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in." And you think it's a Hollywood cliche, but I think they're telling you how it works. You might be retired for 20 or 25 years, but if they've got a mission for you, you're never rid of them.
Yeah, that's what he told me, and I had no reason to believe that he wasn't telling me the truth. Like I said, he was probably around 64, 65 years old. We were taking a course, and it was out in San Francisco, in fact, and he was very nice, and he just started talking with me. We started chit-chatting after class. We must have sat down for about an hour or so, and that's what he said. Essentially, folks, once you're in, you're in. That's it. You could think you're out, you could think you're retired, but that's just a thought. You're not really retired.
Have you ever seen the movie Brotherhood of the Bell?
No, I have not.
Okay, so I mentioned this in the book, and I've put in a couple of links to where people can watch it online, because it's very difficult to get this film now. I can't imagine why it's so difficult, or why it's been withdrawn from distribution. Basically, it's a made-for-TV movie from 1970. It stars Glenn Ford, and it's a very thinly veiled reference to Skull and Bones, the Skull and Bones Society out of Yale. So it's presented as fiction, and you've got this guy, Glenn Ford, who's middle-aged businessman, and he once attended this prestigious Ivy League college, which is supposed to be a representation of Yale, and he was involved in this secret society fraternity as part of that college. And he gets called on because this secret society is recruiting a new member into its ranks, and so they call all the old members back as part of this induction ritual. And he gets reminded that, whenever the Brotherhood calls on you and has a mission for you, then you have to step to it. And you might have had 20 years away from it without being called on, but once that call comes, you're required to act on it. And he gets that call. Basically, there's this high academic position up for grabs in one of the universities, and a friend of the Glenn Ford characters is due to get it. But the Brotherhood says, we want to make sure he doesn't get it because we want to put one of our guys in there instead. Your job is to get this guy to refuse the role. So Glenn Ford has a word with his friend, and he tries all ways of coercing him into not taking the job. And in the end, he has to come out and basically tell him, he says, "Look, I'm a part of this secret society. I'm going to be in big trouble if you take this job." The friend is outraged and disgusted to hear this, and he runs off in horror. And the next thing Glenn Ford's character finds out is his friend has killed himself. And he's absolutely racked with guilt over this whole thing. And he vows to expose this secret society fraternity and let everyone know what they're all about. And he goes on TV to do this interview to talk about it. But he quickly discovers the power and the influence and the reach of the Brotherhood, because they can shut down everything. They shut down the TV interview. They shut down his bank accounts. They get all his friends to stop talking to him. He loses his job. He loses all his contacts, and it's just a little reminder of the power that these organizations wield. So it's a great movie, and it's telling you again what really goes on, but it's dressing it all up as fiction. And this might be a good opportunity to cross over to the subject of electronic dance music and the acid house scene, because I know we wanted to talk about that, and using Terence McKenna as a segue, because he popped up as part of that whole scene when the rave festival dance music scene was really starting to give off some steam in the UK in the early 90s. He did a series of lectures called Evolution in London in 1992, and he was being used to link the newly emerging electronic dance music coming out of the UK with psychedelics and with all kinds of drugs that were going hand in hand with that scene, particularly ecstasy. So I've got a quote here from one of McKenna's evolution lectures where he said, "With electronic culture, you can create shamans for the global," nice word, "planetary village, and this, to my mind, is the function that rock and roll played in the 60s and house music should play in the 90s. And later he says, through emphasis in house music and rave culture on physiologically compatible rhythms that sound properly understood can actually change neurological states in large groups of people getting together, creating a telepathic community of bonding that hopefully would be strong enough that it would carry the vision out into the mainstream of society." So there's lots to be had from those few quotes. First of all, he's linking the psychedelic counterculture scene of the 60s, where LSD was everywhere, with the electronic dance music scene of the 90s, when ecstasy was the drug of choice. He's then talking about these DJs and producers being shamans and using sound frequencies to change neurological states in large groups of people, i.e. those attending these festivals, just as they did all those hippie gatherings in all those communes in the 60s. And then he talks about carrying the vision out into the mainstream of society. So he's talking about making this electronic dance music scene mainstream and taking it out of the underground, which is, of course, exactly what happened. So it's very interesting that McKenna was there in the 60s, in that counterculture scene, eulogizing for psychedelics and evangelizing about their use. And then he pops up again in the early 90s when this scene is getting going in the UK, and he's up there doing lectures, tying all these different strands together. So that, to me, is another example of how these actors are used for different agendas. They're given these different jobs, and they just have to step to it and do what's required of them.
Yep. And it's this whole thing with combining the music with drugs, too. It's a very, this is what they do. And it's, I guess, to put folks into an altered state of consciousness, which then makes it easier to be able to remap neurologically what's going on in the mind. It makes you wonder, though, is it just an experiment to see where they can take people, or does it have an actual objective? In other words, it's contributing toward an end state. That's something that sometimes I wonder about. I think that there's probably two approaches. I think sometimes it is experimental to see what the reaction is by the masses, but doesn't necessarily have an end state connection, maybe indirectly. And then there are those initiatives that they have, Mark, where it's definitely tied to an end state objective. So, I mean, I don't know whether you agree with that or you see that, that difference.
I think a large part of what was done with this electronic dance music scene coming out of the UK, which started with what was known as acid house. The acid house movement got going late 1987, and then 1988 was known as the second summer of love by the media over here. So is that just a throwaway random phrase, or is that a reference to that earlier summer of love in 1967? Because what we actually had was a rebooting and a repackaging of that whole agenda for a different generation in a different part of the world. I certainly think that's the case, and I make that very clear in the book. I think a large part of what was done was experimental. It was a big social experiment, and these kids that were going along to these raves and that now attend all these big electronic dance music festivals are being treated to a very large extent as lab rats. So the controllers are observing what happens when large groups of people get together, pool their consciousness, get into a sort of hive mind state, and that hive mind state is energized by the drugs that most of these people will be on, and it's exacerbated by the sound frequencies that they're exposed to, because all this music is digital and electronic in nature. So there's all kinds of things that can be loaded into the sound frequencies of the recordings on an unseen level that people aren't aware of. And then you've got all these visuals being flashed up as well. So the scale of these dance music events now is absolutely massive. They take place in sports arenas and these big halls that hold hundreds of thousands of people at a time, or they're open air. And you have these massive screens, like drive-in movie screens, where all these visuals are being flashed up straight into the subliminal mind. Often they're up there for just a split second, which is classic subliminals. You get all manner of occult symbolism and sort of esoteric Freemasonic symbolism being flashed up. And so all this stuff is being absorbed by these people. And I think a large part of it involves them being monitored and observed. I've had many conversations with Emily Moyer of Off Planet Radio about this, who I was with last week. And Emily is of the opinion that she herself has been mind controlled. She's a mind controlled subject. She's spoken about this on shows. And she has said that she doesn't think it's any accident that she started attending all these big dance music events. She's been going raving and partying for years, and it's a big part of what she does. But she does feel that at some stage along the way, she was kind of coerced or manipulated into attending these events. And she gets the impression that many other people in attendance at these events are being monitored and surveilled in the same way that she is. There's also a lady called Kathy Morgan, who I interviewed for one of my podcasts a few months ago. She did a great talk at an event called AwakeCon in the UK back in November. She is of the view that she knows that she was also a mind control subject. She comes from a military family. Here we go again. Her family was moved around when she was very young from place to place, and she settled in the sort of Bath area of the UK where there's a very strong military presence. And she's one of twins, and military intelligence loves doing experimentation on twins. And she says that from a very young age, she underwent all manner of mind control programming. She remembers being in attendance at the very early glut of UK music festivals that kicked off with the Isle of Wight Festival in 1968. Then you had the first Glastonbury Festival in 1970. Then you had the Stonehenge and Windsor Free Festivals following shortly afterwards. And she feels that it's no accident that she found herself in attendance at these events, and she felt that all the other people that were there as well were being observed in some way as part of a massive social experiment. So it does seem that there's more to these events than meets the eye. I think a large part of it is as a big social experiment. But the current generation of electronic dance music festivals we now have has left me in no doubt that what they're being used for in these times is to normalize ideas of transhumanism and of this futurist artificial intelligence society that we now have. I don't even say we're moving towards it because it's here. Obviously, right. There's plans to roll it out even further, but this smart grid reality in which we're now living, where electronic digital ways of doing things are glorified, has been pushed for the last few years big time by these electronic dance music events. I've got a list of the names of some of these big events in the book, and I'll just mention a few of them now. These are done on a massive scale, as I say. Many of these brands come from the same corporation, so you'll find the same company operates 6 or 8 or 10 of these big events. So it's in the hands of a relatively small number of companies, as is always the case. And you can see in the names of these events what this current glut of them is now being used to promote. So we've got Dream State in California, Trance Nation and Luminosity in the Netherlands, Velvet Hypnotized, there's one for you, in Bali, Atlantis in Australia, Spring Awakening in Chicago, Awake in Dresden, Awakening Fridays in LA, Dream Beach in Spain, Delirium Eternity in Argentina. Then you've got Tomorrow World in Atlanta, Tomorrowland in Belgium, Future Music Festival in Australia, New Horizons in Jakarta. So you can see these are all over the world, from Belgium to Australia to California. And in all the titles, you've got evocations of a digital future world and being hypnotized and a dream state, this kind of dissociation from reality. So it's all hinting at mind control and transhumanism, and that is what these events are now being used for. And it's such an elephant in the room, Mike. I mean, when you look at the flyers and the promotional material that's used for these events, anyone that's done 5 minutes research into symbolism and transhumanism will be able to see it instantly. But so few people that are involved in this scene seem to be able to see it. And I'm amazed that I seem to be the only researcher that's out there talking about this stuff. I would have thought there would be hundreds of people that would have spotted this and would be doing podcasts and videos and presentations about it. But from what I can gather, nobody else is. And it's so bloody obvious to me. So I do wonder whether this whole acid house scene from the 80s and everything that it was used to usher in, because basically it laid the foundations for this massive worldwide electronic dance music scene that we now have, which is popular with young people literally the world over. It was always intended 30 years later to use it to glorify and normalize and get into the subliminal minds of the general public these ideas of this transhumanist futurist society, making it more palatable to these young people, doing it on a subconscious basis, and just preparing everyone for what was known to be coming. It seems to me that that was the end game with this whole scene. And of course, you get the Pied Pipers and the leaders of this scene as well. All these DJs and producers that are right up there and are always headlining these festivals. The same names wheeled out time and time again. Paul van Dyk is a major one, German DJ. Then the likes of David Guetta and Tiesto and Afrojack and Calvin Harris, Steve Aoki, Pete Tong, Carl Cox, guys like this. Every scene has its Pied Pipers. These are the ones that have been selected to wave the flag for this whole scene. And the level of denial among dance music fans is absolutely incredible. So I go on the Facebook pages of some of the artists that I've just mentioned every now and again, just to see what people are saying about them. And so they'll announce that they're going to be playing at one of these big events, Digital Dreams or Tomorrowland or whatever it is. And all the comments just are completely mind controlled. People are just saying, oh, you know, you're awesome. You're a god to me. This is the language they use. You are my god. I bow down and worship you. I hang on your every word, you know, I check your every move. You are my life. I've followed you for the last 20 years. You're awesome to me. It's absolutely incredible that they can have people under their grip. And it does seem to happen in this genre, in electronic dance music. Well, I don't know if it happens more than in rock music or heavy metal or whatever, because I don't follow those scenes too closely. But I can say the level of attachment that some of these fans have to these demigods that have been served up to them, that they put up on these pedestals, just beggars belief. They don't seem to be able to see what's slapping them around the face, what's beating them with a baseball bat saying, look at me, look at me. They're just so hypnotized and entranced by these role models and these false heroes that they can't see what this scene is being used for.
And that's because, Mark, their minds have been stolen. And the sad part is they don't even realize their mind has been stolen. And going back to what you were saying about these guys rolling out these experiments, what's disconcerting to me is that they are way ahead of the curve on, I'm not talking about they, I'm talking about Tavistock, I'm talking about intelligence organizations that are rolling out these social engineering and mind control programs. They have them rolled out decades in advance with a knowledge and an understanding of where it's going 20, 30, 40 years from now. That's the scary part.
Exactly.
You see? So that says that they know an enormous amount they have an enormous amount of information and research under their belts. They know how the human mind thinks, how it operates, and how it will respond.
Exactly.
That's the thing. And so that's why people buy into this stuff, and these DJs and these artists and these bands are gods to them, because people are so oblivious. They are so ignorant to what is really going on around them. And that, of course, you can't, and I'm not picking on people, folks. I don't want you to think, oh, Mike's getting on his high horse and he's picking on people. I'm not. What I'm saying is decades after decades after decades after decades of this stuff, we end up with the population that we have, which is a population that doesn't expect a whole lot. We have a population that does not really think about tomorrow. It barely thinks about the moment that they're in right now.
Right.
And everything becomes gratuitous. Everything is instantaneous gratification. And the other problem, Mark, is that technology is glorified, right? Because they keep being told that technology is good for you. Technology is going to improve your life. Technology is going to make you a better person. That's the whole transhumanism thing. Don't you want to live don't you want to live on a hard drive in a computer somewhere, your consciousness, so that you can, 500 years from now? No, I don't want that. What are you talking about? But there are people that look at that and think, oh my God,
that's so cool.
That would be so cool and unbelievable. Yeah, I want that. And that's the problem that we have, is that, getting back to my original point, is how did we get here? How did we get to a point where people just eat this stuff up and just pray to their demigods of rap, of electronic music, of rock? It's decades of very, very brilliant, systematic, methodical mind control and social engineering by people who understand it like no one can possibly understand. I can tell you that I'm a hypnotherapist, and I know you know, and a lot of the listeners know this. When I first got started with my practice, it was very interesting to see how you can have hypnosis sessions to get somebody to stop doing something that they were doing for decades. So as an example, if somebody smoked for 40 years, smoking 2 packs a day for 40 years, and then when they came to me, and within a couple of sessions, they walk out of my office and they never smoke again. So that's a good story, right? Because you want people to be healthy and not smoke. But think about that. Think about the fact that somebody was doing something habitually for 40 years. And then after working with their mind, they don't do it anymore. And that's just Mike in his office as a hypnotherapist working with a client one-on-one. Now, if you extrapolate that out and you take it to the extent and the degree of the knowledge and the research and the technology that Tavistock has and the intelligence agencies have, it's absolutely mind-blowing.
Right.
What they can do and where they can take the masses.
So, if you can achieve that as a hypnotherapist, and you've demonstrated how your craft can be used for positive ends to stop somebody smoking, for example, of course it can be flipped on its head and the reverse would be true. So in the hands of somebody that knows what they're doing but has malevolent intent and doesn't want to help people but actually wants to harm them, those same processes can be used to mind control program large numbers of people to get them to adopt certain behaviors, against their own self-interest. But if somebody knows what they're doing, then that's there at their disposal. It's the same thing as sound being used for healing, which it so often is. There are therapy centers where people go to heal themselves of all manner of physical ailments and diseases, and there's stories of people that have been in comas for years, and they're exposed to either friendly sound frequencies or a favorite piece of music that really means something to them, and it's brought them out of a coma when everything else has failed. So sound can be used for these benevolent means. But again, the opposite is true. Remember that Kate Bush record, Experiment 4, where she's talking about the weaponization of sound. Sound can be used to do great harm to large numbers of people. So it just depends who it's in the hands of, which is always the case. Just going back to what you were saying about the way young people are obsessed with technology, and they quite clearly are, they've been entrained to think of technology as really cool. And guys like Elon Musk and all the stuff that he's doing as well. Look at what this dude is up to. This is amazing, man. And that's the way transhumanism is being marketed. Look at what we can do. Just imagine being able to upload your consciousness into a cloud and then download it into a new body. Isn't it amazing what we can do? Well, not really, no, not to my mind. I know I'm old-fashioned. I know that my views aren't particularly popular, but I was doing an interview about this today, actually, with this guy in Montenegro, and I was making the point that transhumanism is actually a tenet of Satanism. And I'll come right out and say it just like that and put it out there, because that's what it is. What is transhumanism? It's creating an artificial reality, a new reality. It's augmenting, in the words of transhumanism, human beings to become something more than human in the minds of those that are pushing this stuff out there. But what is the underlying implication of all of that? Well, we already have a world, right? We already have a reality, and we already have a creator that put all this stuff into place. Some people would call it God. It doesn't matter what name you put on it, but there is a creative force that put all this stuff into being. Anyone that is trying to create a new reality and a new upgraded form of humanity is basically saying God or the creator got it wrong, and we can do so much better. So it's psychopathy and narcissism and egotism on colossal levels. It's a satanic mindset. Satanism is all about taking what is pure and natural and inherent to creation and turning it on its head so that it emerges as the polar opposite of that. And that's what this transhumanist movement is all about. Taking the version of reality that we have and implying that they can do better because they, in their own minds, are their own gods. They don't want to acknowledge or revere the true God of creation. They want to be their own gods. What's cool about that? Really? There's nothing cool about that. And unfortunately, there's not many people putting it out there like that, but that is the truth of the matter. And these young people are being entrained to think of all this as really cool. Talk about them playing the long game and the controllers knowing what they're going to do decades in advance. My mind always goes back to this German movie called Metropolis. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes.
Right. Directed by Fritz Lang, who was a German Jew and reportedly a Freemason. That's a surprise, isn't it? So he directed this movie in 1927, and it's absolutely astounding because in the narrative, you've got a depiction of this futurist society, and the movie is actually set 100 years into the future. So that's only 9 years away from where we are now. And it just displayed incredible foresight of what was going to be coming. So you got this futuristic cityscape where the elite ruling class live in skyscrapers above ground. They've got flying cars. Elon Musk, anyone? Which they use to get around in. This whole scene was actually portrayed in the video to Queen, Radio Gaga. So they included snippets from this movie, and they're sort of interacting with the old black and white footage. You see the band members of Queen flying around in this car around this futuristic city. And then the working class, the great unwashed, that's you and me, are toiling away underground in really harsh, intolerable conditions, keeping the city functioning and serving the elite ruling class. And that is just an amazing metaphor for the type of society we have and where they want to take things further. They want these amazing futuristic ways of doing things all for themselves, this elite ruling class, but they've got a different plan in mind for the rest of us, the slave class, as they see us. So there we were in 1927 with Fritz Lang and whoever else was behind this movie putting it out there, a kind of wish list for what they wanted to be achieving nearly 100 years into the future. If that doesn't display this concept of knowing what's going to be coming decades into the future, then I don't know what does.
Absolutely, Mark. And you can also go back to the Protocols of Zion, which was written in the early 1900s. I think it was
1903, I think.
1903 is when people became aware of it. You read the Protocols of Zion, it's all there. And if you read it today, you're going to be thinking to yourself, well, how in the world did they know 115 years ago what was going to transpire over the next 100 years, So that's the thing. I mean, they have such a handle on this. And of course, they can have a handle on it because they are in control. When you control the system, when you control the money, you control the governments, when you control all that stuff, you control the media, academia, and so on, then it makes it a lot easier to be able to put your agenda forward and to achieve it. So, and that's the thing, and I tell folks all the time, we are looked upon as a slave class. That's and right. You go to work every day, and I'm not a slave. Well, you pay taxes, right? Yeah. Well, you're not keeping your money.
If you think you're not a slave, try not going to work for a month and see what happens.
Exactly right. See who feeds you and see who puts a roof over your head.
Right.
Okay. And that's the thing, that's the thing. People don't even realize that they're in a slave system. It's really amazing to me. I just wanted to go back 1 second to touch back on this whole thing with mind control and hypnosis, Mark. I meant to bring this to your attention and send you this link, and I'll send it to you during the show here so you can take a look at it afterwards. But Samsung has launched a website. Get a load of this. Promising to wipe your favorite TV series from your memory so you can watch it again seemingly for the first time. And
what?
The name of, yes. Yep. It's a video that's on their website. It's called Unspoil Me. It uses hypnosis to erase memories of a show, allowing you to watch it for the first time.
Oh my days.
I'm not kidding you, okay? And I haven't looked at it yet. I went to the website. I haven't watched the video yet because you have to be very careful when you watch this stuff, folks. So I'm going to, as a hypnotherapist, I'm going to take a look at it. I'm going to break it down. But Mark, I'll send you this link, and it is absolutely unbelievable.
The only thing more astounding than the news that they're doing it is the knowledge that there are going to be people that think it's really cool and they're going to be queuing up to be a part of it, because there are.
Well, I can tell you right now, there's tons of people that went to that website and they're using it for other things, right? The website says you only use it to forget movies or shows that you've watched, okay? Don't use it for anything else, but people are going to be going there and they're going to focus on other things, people, places, right. Whatever it may be, right? That's right. The nature of people. And your point is well taken. people are going to look at this. You and I are aghast at this. I saw this. I thought to myself, you've got to be kidding me. This is so in our face. And there are going to be people that are going to look at that link or go to that site, and they're going to think it's the greatest thing since the light bulb.
It just reads like the plot to another Hollywood movie. It's just like, you can imagine a film would come out and the plot would be, hey, this company has developed a system of erasing these TV shows from your mind. And people would look at it and go, oh, that's a bit far-fetched. They'd come out of the movie theatre. How was the film? Well, it was okay, but the plot, come on now. And yet here it is.
Yep. There you go. I put it in the chat box for you there. So after the show, you can take a look at it. I'm sure that it's going to feed into and help with some other discussions you have on some other shows. It's really quite amazing, Mark. It's probably one of the most staggering things I have seen in a long time. And folks, that's saying a lot because I look at a lot of stuff. This one, it took the cake, at least for this month. I'm sure something else will come up, that will beat it next month or the month after that.
Just remind me why we decided to incarnate into this reality at this point in the timeline again. I can't quite remember.
Yeah. I
need
ask myself
reminding.
I'll tell you what, we're here to try to wake up as many people as we possibly can. And we're not going to wake everybody up. In fact, most people are not going to wake up. But
that's right.
There's going to be that small minority of folks that are going to get the message and be better off for it. I always tell folks, look, people will say to me, Mike, knowing all this stuff, doesn't it bother you? I mean, doesn't it get in your way of living your life? Doesn't it make you worried? Does it make you scared? I said, no, absolutely not. In fact, pursuing the truth and knowing the truth actually empowers me. It makes you less scared because when you see their events and all the stuff that they're doing, because you know the backdrop and you know what it is that they're doing and how they operate, you actually take it in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
You don't have that fear. So anyway.
Well, I'm the same. I'm the same in myself. I've got a certain amount of concern for my kids because they're very young and I can see the madness and the insanity that they're going to have to grow up in. And it's any parent's instinct to worry about their offspring, But in myself, no, I feel empowered by knowing what I do. And I heard you on the Freeman show the other week talking about how in all realisticness, you don't expect to see any major change in your lifetime. And I don't either. I think it's going to be a hard slog for however many years we've got left, just doing the work that needs to be done. And any benefits that are going to be felt by humanity on a collective basis is going to come maybe several generations into the future. Maybe it's going to be our descendants who get to benefit from a better way of living. But just because you needn't expect to see any results in your own lifetime doesn't mean you've got to stop doing the work. You take on a personal responsibility once you discover all this stuff to communicate it to others. Once you've done that in the best way that you can, it's off your shoulders. Now, the responsibility falls on those that have heard the information. It's their karma as to whether they choose to use it to empower themselves and apply it in their lives and maybe change their behaviors in accordance with it, or whether they choose to laugh at it and scoff at it and write you off as a nutter. Once you've done your work, it's no longer, your responsibility. That's just the point I wanted to make there.
Yeah, I don't have a responsibility to convince anybody. I have a responsibility to put what I believe, to put it out there. And I'm already there, and I'm not saying I know everything because I don't know everything. There's just so much out there to learn. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. But based upon what we do know, we know that this world is really off the track, right? It's off the rails. And if we're putting information out there, Mark, you're putting your information out, I'm putting mine, and all of our colleagues are putting information out in different facets, by the way. We're talking about the music industry and the entertainment industry here. Others are talking about GMOs and vaccines and flu shots and mind control and geoengineering, and it goes on and on and on and on, right?
That's right.
And if you decide that you're just not going to look at any of that stuff, that it doesn't mean anything to you, that's on you.
You're cool.
Yep. That's on you. That's not on me. It's not my job to convince you. So if you decide that you're just going to, slop it off and not paying attention to it, like you said, call us whack jobs, well, okay, fine. Yeah. But, and the thing is, once you get into this, Mark, and I know you know this, right? You can't go back.
Exactly.
You can't go back onto the hamster wheel, back into the matrix.
No, you burned too many bridges. You couldn't go back if you wanted to. Who's going to employ me in a day job now? I don't want a day job, but
Yeah.
I'm unemployable now in most corporations, and I'm fine with that. I don't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And what are you going to do? Reorient yourself back to the old way of thinking? It's never going to happen.
No, it can't happen, and you wouldn't want it to.
No. Anyway, I took us a little off the trail there.
No worries, it happens.
Where'd you want to go next?
We were going to dive into the punk and new wave scene, right?
Yes. Yeah, let's talk about punk and new wave.
So I'm kind of going genre by genre, and people just want me to be a source of great knowledge on all different music genres. So I see comments on my YouTube videos that, why have you not mentioned progressive rock? Why have you done nothing on drum and bass? Well, you try delving into all this information, and you go genre by genre, and you see how much of your personal time and energy it eats up. There's only so much information you can put out within the constraints of this time-space continuum in which we must operate, and with all the limitations of a human mind and a human body, and having a family, by the way, and trying to be, a husband and a father, and going out and doing a day job. You try it.
Exactly. So, they're always saying, this is what you should do. No, hold on a second. I'm already doing something. Okay. Yeah. How about you do something?
Exactly. Someone should look into this. Yes, they should. How about you?
Yeah, exactly. I get the same thing. People will say to me, I listen to your shows, but you should look at this and you should speak to that person. You. I'm like, hold on a second. What are you doing?
Exactly. We all know the answer to that because it's always the same.
So I know I just probably pissed a lot of people off, but too bad. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
What they're doing, the first word is jack and the second word rhymes with bit. Anyway, so yeah, I'm sort of going genre by genre, and in this book I've touched on punk and new wave, and I've got to give credit where it's due. Me looking at this scene is largely due to me having been contacted by this researcher who goes by the name of Nino210, obviously a pseudonym, and he's got a guy that he works with called Masonic Youth. And don't panic, folks, it's just a pseudonym. It's just a witty kind of, piece of wordplay. But anyway, these two guys put me on to the backgrounds of many of the prominent punk and new wave musicians coming out of mainly the US, but also there's some British names in there as well, and some of the managers of these bands. So they're basically picking up the baton from Dave McGowan, as so many people have. So many people have been inspired by the work and the nature of how he put it across in that book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, because I think that was really the first time that style of research had been done in terms of looking at who the fathers of these people were and being prepared to go into the world of military intelligence and ask some questions about why the CIA and the Pentagon and the DOD are cropping up so often, and why there are secret military installations in the middle of communities where lots of musicians live, and asking those kind of questions. I think McGowan inspired so many people to start looking at subjects from that fresh perspective. And certainly these two guys, when they approached me, had done just that. And they brought to my attention some of these nefarious family links. And we find the same thing as we did in McGowan's story from Laurel Canyon, family connections for days going into military intelligence and different aspects of the military service, the Royal Navy, US Air Force, the Marines, connections going into the Ivy League colleges, so Harvard and Yale crop up endlessly, Skull and Bones crops up, the Bohemian Club, the Century Club, links on the British side of things to the Tavistock Institute, the Frankfurt School, Cambridge and Oxford universities, all these different social changing culture creation think tanks. So first of all, I just want to go into the origins of the word punk itself, because again, this was something that was discussed on one of Jan Irvin's Gnostic media shows, where he had Joe Atwill on. Those two have fallen out just recently. They don't do shows together anymore. Insert facepalm, but I won't go into that anymore. They were doing shows together for a time, and they did this one show on the punk scene, and they looked into the meaning of the word punk, the etymology of it. So if the truth of a matter is placed out there in plain sight, we'd expect to learn something about a music genre from the name of it, right? So you look into definitions of the word punk, and they include a young man used as a homosexual partner, especially in prison, an aggressive and violent young man, an inexperienced young person, a cowardly or weak young man, an inferior, rotten, worthless person or thing, or a petty criminal or hoodlum. Not exactly flattering terms. And then to punk someone as a verb is defined as to humiliate, to dupe or deceive, to play a practical joke on. I wonder if that gives us some indication as to how the controllers and the manipulators of this scene felt about those that were buying all the records and going to all these gigs. So these two guys put me on to a bunch of these musicians. I've got to say, I didn't know too much about the punk and new wave scene before it. I'll just give you a few selected highlights. So a name that everyone will know is Debbie Harry, of course, from Blondie, the new wave group that came out of New Jersey, New York. And just last year, she was in an interview with a British newspaper, and she revealed that she discovered Scottish ancestry on the part of her birth mother. So Debbie Harry was actually adopted and raised by Richard and Catherine Harry when she was 3 months old, but her birth name was Angela Trimble, and she discovered her maiden name was Mackenzie, and the Mackenzies are one of the principal clans or bloodlines of Scotland, from where the Scottish rites of Freemasonry originates, of course. Debbie Harry also cropped up as a guest at the spirit cooking dinners of Marina Abramovich in late 2016, when that whole ugly mess started making certain headlines. And she was pictured at one of these strange rituals where they have a cake fashioned in the shape of a woman's body, in a ritual that seems to be derived from the sex magic practices of Aleister Crowley. And Gwen Stefani and Lady Gaga are among other stars who have associated with Abramovich, and Jay-Z has named her as his spiritual advisor, as well as Usher and Kim Kardashian. So there's some stuff about Debbie Harry. She also claims to have escaped the clutches of Ted Bundy. She's told this story about how she was hitchhiking in New York when she was very young, new to the city, and this guy stopped and offered her a lift. She got in the car. It was Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and she got bad vibes from him and panicked and tried to get out the car, and she just narrowly escaped who knows what. That's a story that she's told. There's other connections between the punk scene and serial killers. So we've got this one here where the singer John Joseph from the hardcore punk outfit the Cro-Mags, he stated in an interview that he'd known the notorious murderer Joel Rifkin, currently serving a 203-year sentence for the killings of 9 women. One of Rifkin's victims was a prostitute named Tiffany Bresciani, who was dating Dave Rubenstein, the singer from another hardcore band called Reagan Youth. Following the murder of Tiffany and the death of his mother in a car accident, Rubenstein overdosed on heroin and died aged 28. That's another thing we get in this whole punk and new wave story. Early deaths, and very often from heroin overdoses. You know, it's all lovely, family-friendly stuff. Joel Rifkin, when not raping and murdering, just happened to become a landscape gardener to Sophia Casey, the widow of the former CIA director William Casey. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to. On to the Cro-Mags bassist, Harley Flanagan. His mother, Rose Falou Pettet, seemed to have been something of a rock groupie with the likes of the New York Dolls and the Velvet Underground. She hung out at Andy Warhol's factory studio before becoming the spiritual wife to the occultist Harry Everett Smith. And Smith was a member of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which seems to have had a strange magnetic-like lure for many rock stars and celebrities over the years. There's a Detroit 1960s proto-punk group called MC5, Motor City 5, and there's a couple of members of that group, Wayne Kramer and Michael Davis, who turn out to have been inmates at the Federal Medicine Center in Lexington, Kentucky, known initially as the United States Narcotic Farm. It's described as a federal prison for inmates requiring medical or mental health care, but it also happens to have been one of the key hospitals involved in the CIA's MK-Ultra drug experimental program. So you've got these 2 members of this punk group that attended this institution. And William Burroughs, the beat poet, by the way, attended the same institution. Pretty crazy. I've got
It's unbelievable, Mark. I'm listening to you, and this stuff is not like, what a coincidence.
Yeah, 1 or 2 you could chalk up as coincidence, right? But when it keeps happening... Right. This is some random stuff. It's not necessarily punk related, but I went into a piece in the book talking about Nirvana and the fact that Dave Grohl was involved in Nirvana with Kurt Cobain before he went off to form the Foo Fighters. And I've said in the book, would any reader by this point be surprised to learn that Courtney Love, the wife of Kurt Cobain, many researchers suspect her to have been complicit in his murder. Courtney Love is also the daughter of Hank Harrison, who was the one-time road manager for the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead are known to have been direct assets of the CIA. They also have connections into Skull and Bones and Bohemian Grove. And of course, they were right there at the forefront of that whole counterculture hippie scene in the 60s. What were Grateful Dead fans known as? Deadheads, right? Is
Right.
that another clue as to the contempt that the controllers behind these acts had towards the people that would be lapping up the music, the same way as the punk scene was named in that way? And I'm going off at tangents now, but the word hippie and also the word hipster were derived from the days of opium dens, by all accounts, when people would go into these places and lie on their hips and hit the pipe and get high and just pass out, basically. That's where the word hippie came from. So the implication there is that this tribe that emerged in the 1960s were basically a bunch of stoners that just got whacked out and dissociated from reality and didn't contribute anything meaningful to society. So the clue is so often in the name. But anyway, yeah, so Hank Harrison was this CIA-connected guy, the father of Courtney Love, and I've said, would any reader by this point be surprised to learn that Courtney Love is also a distant cousin of Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was an actor but also a decorated naval officer? A link from the punk scene back to its earlier counterculture cousin comes via Dr. Timothy Leary, another CIA asset. He interviewed the British punk rocker and former Generation X frontman Billy Idol in 1993 for an ABC show called In Concert. And the conversation laps at the fringes of transhumanism, where the pair are discussing Billy Idol's cyberpunk album. And according to the promotional blurb, Billy Idol discusses a small amount of the technology behind the cyberpunk album. He notes how it was completely produced on a computer. Timothy Leary sees Billy Idol as creating his own reality. So here we are again in 1993 with references to, pretty clear references, to this transhumanist futurist reality that we've now got. And Billy Idol appears to have been used as part of that whole thing, as was Timothy Leary. And then we remember McKenna being wheeled out to talk about electronic dance music and the links there to psychedelics and shamanism and all of that. An earlier punk link with Timothy Leary had come in 1987 when the Dead Kennedys singer turned spoken word artist and political activist Jello Biafra had shared a bill with Leary reading poetry at the River City reunion event in Kansas. Also on the bill were William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, those beat poets. Ginsberg, as a matter of interest, was a prominent member and spokesman for NAMBLA, which is the North American Man-Boy Love Association, this organisation which campaigns for men to be able, grown men, to be able to have legally sex with underage boys, with minors, without penalty. That's what that organisation is all about. Courtney Love, all kinds of overlapping links here, had a bit part in the movie Sid and Nancy, directed by Alex Cox, which came out in 1986, and of course it documented the tragic lives of Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols and his girlfriend Nancy Spungen. That whole thing was centered around the Chelsea Hotel in New York, which is a very interesting place. And it's also intriguing to me that the punk scene that came out of London, largely spearheaded by Malcolm McLaren and the Sex Pistols, who he managed, was centered around Chelsea, the Chelsea part of London. So McLaren had this shop known as Sex, which he ran with Vivienne Westwood, on the King's Road in Chelsea, and the Sex Pistols were basically created out of that shop, and they wore all the fashions that came out of Sex, and that's how the Sex Pistols got their name. That all emerged out of Chelsea. And then over in New York, you had so much of the punk scene, as the earlier beat poet scene had been, centered around the Chelsea Hotel. So what a coincidence that we have two Chelseas. Or is it? You know, does this hint at the whole thing being contrived? The Chelsea Hotel is a very interesting place. So many prominent writers and celebrities and musicians and famous people of one sort or another have resided there at some point or another. Just to mention a few of them, Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey there, Allen Ginsberg and the beat poet Gregory Corso were residents there. Jack Kerouac, another beat poet, wrote his novel On the Road in its rooms. Arthur Miller, the playwright, wrote The Chelsea Effect in the early 1960s. Dylan Thomas was staying there when he's said to have died of pneumonia on the 9th of November, 9/11, 1953. Charles Jackson, the author of The Lost Weekend, committed suicide in his room on the 21st of September, autumn equinox, 1968. Others that have lived there included the aforementioned occultist Harry Everett Smith, who died in one of its rooms. Stanley Kubrick lived there for a while, so did Ethan Hawke the actor, Dennis Hopper, of Easy Rider fame, Eddie Izzard the comedian, Uma Thurman the actress, Elliot Gould the actor, Jane Fonda the actress, Russell Brand the actor, and Fake, among many others. And then, of course, on top of all of that, you've got many other suicides that happened there, but the whole Sid and Nancy thing. So, as depicted in the Sid and Nancy movie, Sid is shown as having stabbed Nancy Spungen to death in one of the rooms of the Chelsea Hotel. That connects back into the whole punk scene, of course. So much about this place, the Chelsea Hotel. And it reminds me of the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center over there in Los Angeles, which I mentioned in my first book, because so many celebrities have been rushed, in inverted commas, to Cedars-Sinai under some pretense or another. So Britney Spears had her famous meltdown, and she was rushed to Cedars-Sinai for medical evaluation. Biggie Smalls' Notorious B.I.G. was apparently rushed there as well, even though there was a closer hospital available when he was gunned down in 1997. Charlie Sheen had a bit of a meltdown where he started ranting about 9/11 being an inside job. Next thing you know, he's being rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. What this suggests to me is that Cedars-Sinai is probably some kind of covert mind control facility where celebrities go for this type of treatment. So then when you take it back to the Chelsea Hotel in New York and the fact that so many famous people have been involved in that place and have lived there, and there's been suicides there and reports of occult rituals happening in the basement, are we looking at the same kind of thing happening at the Chelsea? Is this some kind of mind control facility as well? There's a famous song by the British New Wave artist, or Irish English, Elvis Costello. He put out a song in 1978 called I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. And I'd always took that to mean he doesn't want to go to Chelsea in London. But what if he was talking about I don't want to go to the Chelsea Hotel? Because he's got a lyric in that song which goes, men come screaming dressed in white coats, shake you very gently by the throat. Could he be displaying knowledge of what goes on at that particular institution? It goes on. Depeche Mode's singer Dave Garn shot a video for one of his songs there. The Grateful Dead, Tom Waits, Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, Jeff Beck, Dee Dee Ramone, Phil Lynott, Cher, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Alice Cooper, Janis Joplin, Bette Midler, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, Canned Heat, and Leonard Cohen all spent time there. Not your average Travelodge. What is the appeal of the Chelsea Hotel? That's what I'd like to know.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Mark, is that, it's when you start to connect the dots, like clearly you have connected the dots, this is not coincidence. It's obviously something is going on with the Chelsea Hotel.
What else would be luring all these people there? Something's going on. It's not just a bloody hotel.
Right, exactly. And you were talking a little bit, going back just for a second, like, and this is probably going to be out of left field, but you mentioned Dave Grohl.
Yeah.
And from the Foo Fighters, and he was the original drummer, I guess, for Nirvana. There's something about Dave Grohl, too, that has always kind of bothered me. He seems like, we talked earlier about those that are kind of lured into the system and those that have always, been destined to be in the system. He seems like one of those that's always been destined to be in the system. He seems to be everywhere these days. It's kind of amazing to me. The guy was a drummer for Nirvana.
Right.
And, he played for the Foo Fighters and everything else, but he seems to be very, very connected. I see him a lot with paying tribute to McCartney, to Billy.
Yeah, you saw that. Right?
Yeah, he always seems to be connected, is always there at these events.
Right.
So he's another one that just seems to be front and center, and somebody who was primed to be doing what he's doing today.
Well, exactly. there's this story from last year of Dave Grohl breaking his leg after he fell off a stage in Switzerland. And Paul McCartney, whoever he may be, organised his surgery. And Grohl gave this quote to a magazine where he says, he knows some good fucking doctors. Yes, I bet he fucking does.
Yeah.
when it comes, I bet Paul McCartney knows some great doctors. But the thing about Dave Grohl, which was brought across my radar by this guy Nino, is when you do some digging into his background, Dave Grohl's father was James Harper Grohl. He worked in the world of politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert A. Taft Jr.'s father was William Howard Taft, who was the 27th President of the United States. And his father, in turn, was Alphonso Taft, who was a founder of Skull and Bones. Then we've got Dave Grohl dating Kathleen Hanna for a time, who is now married to Adam Horovitz of the Beastie Boys. Kathleen Hanna was in the groups Bikini Kill and Le Tigre as part of the underground feminist punk movement known as Riot Girl, and has stated that she was greatly influenced by Gloria Steinem, who turns out to have been an asset of the CIA and created that whole feminist movement as a social weapon against the family unit, all to do with breaking up the traditional family unit and getting women out of the home, away from caring for their kids, into the workplace, paying tax. That's what that whole thing was all about. And we also find out that this Kathleen Hanna, who Dave Grohl dated, has connections to the eugenics organisation Planned Parenthood, and at many gigs where her band would play, Planned Parenthood would be operating a promotional booth, you know, putting out their literature and stuff. Another interesting thing about Dave Grohl is the Foo Fighters put out an album a few years ago, and they hit upon this novel marketing gimmick where they recorded the album on analog tape. This was a gimmick because by that point, all music was being mastered to computers, right? So they had the idea of, wouldn't it be a great thing to record it onto analog tape the way it used to be done? And they then had the idea of shredding this original analog tape on which the album was mastered and putting a tiny little shard, a microscopic shred of tape into each of the jewel cases of the CDs of this album. So consumers would go out and buy a copy of this album on CD, and there'd be a tiny little piece of tape in it, which seems like a really cool marketing idea on one level. But when you go back to something that I mentioned in the first book, which was the comments by this guy John Todd in the 1970s, who came from a long-running generational bloodline of witches, and he was put to use in the American recording industry. He got high-level jobs in many different record labels, and he became something of a whistleblower in the 1970s. You can find some of his talks on YouTube where he started to spill the beans about some of the ritual practices that go on routinely among the big record labels in the US and beyond. So there again, we got an example of somebody that comes from one of these generational bloodlines that is put to use in one of these industries. So you can bet he was given that role. John, you're going to be working in the music industry. Somebody else, you're going into politics. You know, that's your role. So he spilt the beans on what was done. And he talked of how the record companies would all have this altar room in their company HQs. And they would bring the master tape of a new recording into this room and wheel in a coven of witches. That's what he said. It's not me saying this, it's John Todd saying this. And he said this coven of witches would put a hex or a spell. They'd imbue this master tape with this negative energy. And then every copy that was made of that album from that initial master would carry some of that signature energy out into the public domain with it. So now we've got this story of Dave Grohl mashing up this piece of analog tape and putting a little shard of it into the CD jewel cases of the album. What if that's a modern rendering of this same tenet? When you listen to the work of Janice Barcelo, she talks about the pornography industry. And she's got this story of how when they do a master of a porno film, they imbue that with negative energy, she says. And so every copy that's then made of that tape or DVD or whatever and goes out there into the public has some of that energy charged into it. There's a story of Robert McAfee of McAfee Software, a story which you can get online. It was in the mainstream news. He opened a new corporate building somewhere, And the story is that he brought in a bunch of witches, and he had them perform a ritual on the lawn of this building to kind of bless it, I guess, or, imbue it with some kind of energy. And then the final story along these lines is Winston Churchill was, by all accounts, an occultist. He was into all this stuff. And there's this story I've heard of how he, when the Germans were poised to invade England, and it was expected they would be sending a fleet of ships over the English Channel, put a bunch of witches in robes up on the cliffs of Dover or wherever it was in Kent, and they stood and sent out this energy across the channel, presumably to repel this fleet of ships that was supposed to be coming. So there's all these different stories about how energy is harnessed and is imbued with intent and will, and is sent out there into the ether, And we appear to have a couple of variations on this from the music industry, and one of them involves Dave Grohl. So, yeah, connections for days, man.
Yeah, it's just something about Dave Grohl that doesn't sync up with me. It's just something about that guy. I don't know.
I know what you mean.
He just does not radiate positive energy to me. And that's just me, folks. I know there's people out there that love the guy, but it's just something about him that I just don't grab onto.
Sure.
Yeah, notice that, this ritual stuff, Mark, and the occult stuff, and putting occult information out there, and rituals and ceremonies, all of this stuff is real.
It is.
This is real. This is another thing that people just refuse to accept. Oh, that's ridiculous. They don't do that stuff, Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And it's because you're not seeing it in a way that's depicted on TV.
Right.
On a pentagram, standing in it with, salt drawn around a circle and all that stuff.
Sacrificing a chicken and all that.
Exactly. You don't see it. So you're not seeing that. So you think it doesn't exist. But like you said, they do it in ways which you're not going to see it. You're not supposed to see it. That's why you don't see it. That's why you have to research to understand what it is that they do and what they're involved in.
Yeah, there is that. But I do feel that in most cases, they find some way of adhering to this tenet of placing the truth in plain sight. In some way, they give you a little opportunity to know. Of course, they're not playing fair, because 99.9% of people out there could never reasonably be expected to understand what's being communicated to them. But as they see it, that's why they insert their little icons and motifs into pop videos. That's why they do it at stage shows. That's why rock stars flash up hand signals and all this stuff. They are.
Well, their attitude is, if you're not smart enough to pick up on it, that's your problem. That's their attitude.
Exactly that. If you're too profane and ignorant to understand, then, hey, you'll look out. We did our bit. Right. That's the way they see it. So I do feel in most cases, there's some way to know what they're doing if you've got the time and the energy and the will and the benefit of having done the research to understand it all. But like I say, they're not being fair with it. These are sick, twisted individuals, and they've got sick, twisted ways of seeing things. But it does make some sense of why we get things like predictive programming, why symbols are everywhere, why hand signs are everywhere, because people want to know why all that stuff is done. They'll see rockers flashing up the horned hand or the pyramid sign or whatever, and you can see it's there, but people don't understand why it would be done so much, and that's why it's done. They're in their own demonic, distorted way, giving you a chance to understand what they're all about. And I think people are slowly coming round to this through the likes of you and I and the many other people that are doing this kind of work. We're putting it out there, guys like Freeman and guys like my friends Matt Sergiu and Carl James in the UK and Isaac Weishaupt and Michael Joseph. We're all doing our bit in getting people used to these ideas that we have occultists running all these areas of our lives, and they like symbolism and they do ritual shit. I think people are slowly coming round to this realization. And I think if you can make it cool for people, that's a good thing, because I know a lot of young people like the Vigilant Citizen website, and they like Illuminati Watcher, Isaac's website, and maybe they like the work of Michael Joseph, because it's kind of cool to talk about secret societies and the Illuminati and the New World Order and stuff. And if that's what it takes to get the information across to people,
Fine.
That's all good. If they do it because it's cool and fashionable, it doesn't really matter as long as the information is getting out there. That's something that makes my job slightly easier, in that I can talk to young people about Beyonce and Jay-Z and Katy Perry and Kanye West and Lil Wayne and Drake. And those are things that make young people's ears prick up. Oh, God, what is it? What do I need to know about Drake, Whereas with an older person, if I start talking about the Grateful Dead or the Doors or the Rolling Stones, that's going to make their ears prick up. And if that's what it takes to engage people in this type of conversation and then upgrade them from just music stuff into other areas of what's going on in the world, then fine. You use whatever tactic you can. Yeah, I'm not always optimistic about the way things are going to pan out, but I think when it comes to this stuff, symbolism in music, it's becoming so blatantly obvious now what they're doing that you got to be in a very heavy state of denial or under very heavy mind control not to be able to see that something is up.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mark. And I've always said that as it gets stepped up more and more, as they try to push the agenda forward, things are going to get tougher and tougher and more challenging. And by the sheer fact that that level of challenge is stepped up, more and more people will wake up to it. You're always going to have those that are going to be asleep, but hopefully there comes a point where there's enough for a critical mass where we could start to turn the tide. And you were correct. On the Freeman Show, I had said that this is not something that's going to be solved in my lifetime. I'm 59 years old, so it's not going to happen in my lifetime. What we're doing is table setting, because I believe in the ages, that we go through cycles. And so in Hinduism, we would be in the Kali Yuga, which is the Iron Age from the Greek perspective. And each of these cycles has a transition period. So we, I believe, are in that transition period. But it's not like a big switch gets thrown up in the universe someplace. It's a process that is incremental and it's methodical. And there are those of us that have come here, incarnated here, to help with that transition, to get people and souls to start shifting gears and get off the road that they've been on. That's my take on it. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you was you were talking about all these different areas and these different artists that you can talk about, and it peaks different people's ages, like different age groups. And maybe you've gotten this too, but I've had people contact me on a number of occasions and told me that the McCartney conspiracy or the Paul is Dead stuff, that the shows I was doing, actually woke them up to other conspiracies. Before that, they weren't focused on 9/11. They weren't focused on these staged events. They weren't focused on any of that stuff.
Right.
And then, it was the McCartney conspiracy that made them step back and say, well, wait a minute. And I've received a number of emails saying that. So
yeah, because if the world is basically okay and everything's basically normal and sane, and our governments just want what's best for us and are just trying to take care of us, and you accept that McCartney was replaced, you think, well, how can that have been allowed to happen? Surely the security services would know about this. How could the Queen knight this guy? How has he not been rumbled? Well, the only way any of that could not have taken place is if the world is not nice and pleasant, and if governments don't care about us and aren't out for our best interests. So yeah, suddenly a whole different world of possibilities opens up to you.
Yeah, and I bring that up because there are people that really, they'll say, well, I don't understand why this is a big deal, why you guys talk about this. What's the big, it's just a musician, blah, blah, blah. So, I can go into that as a whole, another show we can do on that. But just to cut to the chase, one of the reasons is because it has woken people up that were not awake before to the bigger picture of conspiracy that just swirls around us every single day of our life.
Right.
So from, even if it's just that alone, that's important enough to be able to talk about things like that, or we should be talking about things like that.
Yeah. And really, you can look at the mess the world is in. You mentioned there are those of us that have obviously come here at this time to be doing this work, and it becomes fairly shocking when you don't realize that until you're 40 years of age, right?
Yeah. Hey, I was a late bloomer too, Mark. I was too. I wasn't born with all this stuff in my head. I was on the hamster wheel like everybody else, and I was a late bloomer into this stuff.
Yep. Imagine getting to 40 and then suddenly realizing your entire life has been a lie. But, If that's when it happens, that's when it happens. And clearly
Right.
there are those of us that are here to do this work, and we come to it at different stages, but the important thing is that you come to it. And when you do, you look at the mess that we've got, and it can seem insurmountable. You can think to yourself, how are we ever going to roll this back and get humanity to a stage a place where it needs to be? When you look at all the fracking wells that have now been dug, and you look at all these ugly antennas that are everywhere, and
Right.
the smart grid, the Internet of Things that's been set up, you could think, how are you ever going to dismantle all of that? Even if you got people to a stage where they could accept that it's not a great idea for us to be living like this, how do you undo all of that? And yes, it can seem completely overwhelming. And to my mind, the only way that's ever going to be achieved is through consciousness, through a raising of consciousness of large numbers of people to a point where they can all get on the same page, and the answers then come to you. So you can puzzle over it from a practical point of view and think, how do we solve all this stuff? But it's only going to come through heightened consciousness, and it's only going to come when there's a tipping point and a quantum amount of the world's population that reached that stage. And so, the battle becomes winning over people's consciousness.
Yes.
That's the only way any significant change is going to be achieved, I feel. And I think
that's why that's why the controllers spend all of their time trying to manipulate your thoughts and your consciousness. They know this.
Right. Because, short of the world being destroyed and everyone having to go back from the caveman era and start again from scratch with a blank sheet of paper, I don't know how things are ever going to get to the stage where they need to be unless it's through consciousness.
Right.
There's a record by a female rapper called Quay, and I quote the lyric from it in my talks. She's got a great song called Wake 'Em Up, and it's one of my favorite songs. One of the lyrics goes, "To be honest with you, I don't really know how we're going to change this, but we have to." There it is, right there in that lyric.
There you go.
That's the mission.
Yep. Well, Mark, it's been a fabulous discussion. It's always really a lot of fun to talk to you because, well, first of all, because you're a friend and it's easy to talk to your friends.
Right.
And but enormous amounts of information. And your new book is Musical Truth 2. It's been out since February. And why don't you fill the audience in on where they can get a copy of the book and also where they can connect with you, websites and stuff like that?
Sure. Well, Musical Truth 2 is available on Amazon, as is Musical Truth 1. So it's in paperback, hardback, and Kindle version from Amazon, which is a nice, easy way of getting it. But not everyone likes Amazon. They're not the most ethical company in the world. So if anyone wants to get a copy from me direct, I'm happy to sign a copy. Of course, it always helps authors out when people go to them direct, because you get a better cut of the sale rather than it go into the corporation. So if anyone wants to email me and pay by PayPal, then I can get a book out to you. I do post to the US. I post all over the world. The postage isn't as much as you might think. So drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com and we can get a conversation going where I can get a book out to you. I'm doing some talks to promote the book. I was just in the US actually last week. I was in Phoenix for the Truth Mind Reality Conference, and I did a book launch at a store in LA. I'm not coming back to America this year unless I end up going to Connecticut. That's another story. But my talks for the rest of this year are going to be in the UK and Europe. So I'm going to be touching Sweden, also Denmark and Ireland. And there's information on where I'm touching down on my main website, which is markdevlin.co.uk. And that acts as a hub for all my other stuff. So I've got a Spreaker site where I host all of my audio. All of my podcasts are up there. All of my radio interviews are archived up there as well. So just go to markdevlin.co.uk. You get the link through to there. I've got a YouTube channel as well. I know you've had some issues with YouTube, but I'm still hanging on in there. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. I've got a load of my conference talks up on there, and all my Spreaker podcasts are converted into YouTube files as well, so you can catch up with those on the YouTube channel. So that's pretty much it. I want to thank you for getting me back on, Mike. It was a great conversation, and I've covered some points in this chat that I've not in other radio interviews, because, it gets a bit tedious when you just trot out exactly the same information on every radio interview. So I've tried to bring some different stuff to the table here, and I think it's been quite a stimulating conversation as a result. So thanks again.
Oh, you're very welcome, Mark. It was a great conversation. And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.
Just a cog because you're on. Yeah, you're on. You work a job just to survive. You have a pulse, but you're not alive because you're on. Still so blind because you're old.